The night was heavy with the smell of rain and smoke, and the sound of the wind rolled through the valley like a low growl. Lanterns flickered in the windows of Pine Hollow, a quiet settlement tucked between the red cliffs and the endless plains of Arizona Territory. It was the kind of town where gossip traveled faster than the mail coach, and every stranger's shadow stirred old fears. Folks here lived between prayers and loaded rifles, always watching the horizon. But that night, they whispered of something else, something wilder. The return of a giant Apache who once swore vengeance beneath a blood-red moon. A lone carriage rattled down the muddy street, its lanterns cutting through the mist. Inside sat a woman too fine for this part of the world. Her gloved hands trembled as she lifted the curtain, catching the faint outline of cabins, saloons, and barns through the rain. She had come from far across the ocean, from a land of green estates and royal dinners, never imagining she'd find herself in a place where men carried rifles instead of manners. The locals called her the Duchess, not for title but for the way she carried herself, graceful, proud, and terribly out of place. The coach stopped before the inn. The driver, an old trapper with a missing tooth, tipped his hat. "This here's as far as I go, ma'am. Ain't safe beyond the creek tonight." She thanked him softly, stepping down as the rain picked up, her boots sinking in the mud. She had come seeking something, or perhaps someone, but she'd soon learn that in the old American frontier, what you seek often finds you first. Inside, the inn was warm and dim, the air thick with tobacco and wood smoke. The fire popped in the hearth, and the few patrons turned to stare at her as she entered. A woman of her kind didn't belong in a place like this, not with her porcelain face and soft English voice. The barkeep wiped his hands on his apron, nodding respectfully. "Evening, ma'am. Storm's a mean one. You need a room or just a hot drink?" She hesitated before answering, her voice gentle but clear. "Both, please. I'll be staying for some days." Her words caught a few curious looks. Pine Hollow wasn't the kind of place where strangers lingered, unless they were running from something, or chasing it. At the far table sat a man built like a mountain, his shoulders broad beneath a weathered coat. His dark eyes flickered in the firelight, unblinking, watching her. His skin was copper-toned, his hair long and tied with leather. He didn't speak, but the room seemed to shift around his silence. Someone whispered his name, half in fear, half in respect. He was the giant Apache, the one who'd vanished after the army burned his camp, leaving him for dead in the ashes. Folks said he'd become something more than a man since then, something the wilderness itself had claimed. The Duchess caught his gaze for the briefest moment, and her breath faltered. There was something in his eyes, something she recognized but couldn't name. The look of someone who had lost everything, yet still refused to bow. She turned away quickly, her pulse quickening. The barkeep poured her a cup of coffee, though her hands shook too much to lift it. "Best stay inside after dark," the barkeep murmured. "Strange things happen when that wind blows from the mesa. Some say it's the spirits, others say it's him." He nodded slightly toward the man in the corner. "Either way, keep your doors bolted." Outside, thunder rolled over the cliffs like drums of war. The Duchess shivered. She had heard the stories, how the Apache warriors fought like ghosts, how they vanished into the rocks, how they never forgot a debt of blood. Yet something in her heart drew her here, to this wild, untamed place. Something older than reason, older than fear. Later that night, as she sat by the window of her small rented room, she saw him again. He was standing across the muddy street, half in the shadows, half in the glow of lightning. The rain streamed down his bare shoulders and he didn't move, didn't flinch. For a long, breathless moment, their eyes met through the storm. She couldn't look away. It was as if time itself had stopped, as if the mountains were holding their breath. A knock came at her door, soft but certain. She hesitated. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. No answer came, only the deep growl of thunder. She opened the door an inch, peering into the dim hall, but it was empty. Only a folded piece of hide lay on the floor. She picked it up, hands trembling, and unfolded it. Scrawled in charcoal were 4 words that made her heart stop. "Tonight you'll scream my name." She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. Fear and confusion twisted inside her. Was it a threat, a warning, or something else entirely? She turned toward the window again, but he was gone. The rain fell harder, and the lamps outside flickered out one by one. She sat on the edge of the bed, her heart pounding in her ears. Every sound made her flinch, the creak of the walls, the sigh of the wind. Yet beneath her fear was something else, something that frightened her even more. A strange pull, a sense that fate had finally found her. She whispered to herself, "Who are you?" But deep down she already knew the answer. He was the one she'd been told about in hushed voices back east, the man who couldn't die, the warrior who carried vengeance in his blood. Far out beyond the town, on the red mesa where the lightning struck, he stood beneath a lone tree, his face lit by firelight. Around him burned the symbols of his people, the marks of oath and memory, his hand clenched around the hilt of a knife carved from bone, its blade darkened by years of blood and battle. His voice was low, almost like a growl. She will remember, even if it breaks her. The wind carried his words down the slopes, through the pines and into the valley below. The horses in the stable stirred uneasily. Dogs howled. The rain began to ease, leaving only the whisper of the creek and the echo of thunder rolling away into the distance. The Duchess sat awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep, yet unable to leave the window. When the first light touched the mountains, she saw movement near the edge of town, a dark figure watching from the ridge. He didn't move, didn't hide. He wanted her to see him. She rose slowly, pressing her hand to the glass, her breath fogging the window. For reasons she couldn't explain, her fear began to fade, replaced by something heavier, something dangerous. In the morning, the townsfolk found tracks in the mud outside the inn, barefoot prints too large for any ordinary man. The sheriff spat into the dirt and muttered, "He's back." By sundown, the air was thick with tension. Riders came down from the hills, rifles across their saddles. Whispers spread like wildfire, revenge, promises, curses. And somewhere in that quiet, lonely town, a woman with a trembling heart and a secret past found herself caught between two worlds. The civility she had known and the wild justice of a man who had nothing left to lose. As the sun dipped behind the cliffs, painting the valley in red and gold, she heard it again. The low hum of a war chant carried on the wind. The same words she had read on that hide echoed in her mind, louder now, like a vow sealed by the desert itself. Tonight, you'll scream my name, and in that moment, the Duchess forgot how to breathe. The morning after the storm, Pine Hollow woke under a pale sky that looked washed clean. The streets were quiet, save for the groan of wagons and the low murmur of men outside the livery. Smoke from cooking fires curled above the cabins and the scent of damp earth filled the air. The Duchess stood at her window, still in her traveling dress, staring toward the ridge where she had seen the shadowed figure before dawn. The image clung to her mind, those still eyes, the steady stance, the unspoken challenge. Every heartbeat reminded her that he was out there, somewhere between the hills and the desert wind. She could have packed and left that morning. Nothing held her in that dusty town, yet she stayed. Something deeper than curiosity kept her from running. She told herself it was courage, though she knew it was more than that. There was a question buried inside her, and she could not leave until she had an answer. Downstairs, the inn was already alive with talk. The barkeep leaned across the counter, speaking low to a man in a gray duster. "They found tracks by the creek again," he said. "Big ones. Heading west toward the canyon," the other man grunted. "Ain't no bear that walks like that." The Duchess sat quietly at a corner table, her hands around a cup of black coffee. The warmth steadied her, but the whispers drifting from nearby tables set her nerves on edge. "They say he was raised near the San Carlos Hills," one rancher said. "A chief's son before the soldiers came. Lost his whole band in that raid," another answered. "Family, wife, child, all gone. He's been hunting the men who did it ever since." Someone spat in the sawdust. "And if he's come back, you best pray you're not on his list." The Duchess lowered her gaze, heart tightening. The story painted him in shades of grief and vengeance, and suddenly she understood the pain behind his eyes, the anger, the wildness. Yet something else stirred in her, a strange ache of pity. She wondered what kind of man could live after losing so much. The barkeep set a plate before her. "You look pale, miss. Best eat something. You'll need your strength if you're traveling out of here soon." She hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you know him? The one they call the giant Apache?" The man's face tightened. "Ain't wise to say his name aloud, but yeah, I've seen him. Once. Years back before the army burned his camp. He was taller than any man I ever met, strong as two horses. But he had eyes that didn't belong in this world, like he'd already looked death in the face and didn't fear it no more." He paused, lowering his voice. "You're not from around here, miss. You don't know how things work. There are men you can reason with, and then there's him." She nodded quietly. "Maybe I came here to understand that." The barkeep frowned. "Then I pity you." By afternoon, the storm clouds had broken apart, leaving streaks of sunlight across the valley. The Duchess decided to walk beyond the edge of town. The air was warm and smelled of wet sage. She followed the narrow path that led toward the creek, where the cottonwoods whispered above the running water. Her boots sank into soft earth, and every step reminded her how far she was from the marble floors and chandeliers of home. She stopped when she saw the prints, barefoot, deep in the mud. They were too large for any ordinary man. The hair on her arms rose, yet she couldn't bring herself to turn back. She crouched, tracing one with her gloved hand, her fingers trembling slightly. The print was fresh. He had been here not long ago, looking for ghosts, a voice said behind her. She turned sharply. It was the man in the gray duster from the inn, the one who had been talking about the Apache. His weathered face carried the rough calm of a man who'd seen too much. Just walking, she said. He nodded, studying her. You're new here. Folks in Pine Hollow don't wander off alone. Not since he came back, she met his gaze. You speak of him as though he's not human. The man's eyes narrowed. Maybe he ain't anymore. Maybe the desert kept him alive for a reason. He paused, then added, They say he took a vow that night the soldiers burned his camp. He swore he'd never rest until every man who carried a blue uniform that day was in the ground. That's why folks are scared. Some of those men settled right here after the war. They changed names, built homes, raised families. But he remembers. The Duchess felt a chill run through her. And if he finds them? The man shrugged. Then Pine Hollow will bleed. The words lingered in her mind long after he walked away. She wandered further downstream, lost in thought, until the sky began to fade into evening. The canyon walls glowed red in the sinking light, and the cry of a hawk echoed overhead. When she turned to go back, she saw movement among the rocks. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall, broad, silent. Her breath caught. He stood there a few yards away, his eyes fixed on her. The same dark eyes that had haunted her dreams the night before. He didn't speak, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. Her throat tightened, her heart pounding like a drum. You shouldn't be here, she managed to say. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. His hair was damp, his chest bare beneath a torn deerskin vest, his skin marked by faint scars. This is my land, he said, his voice deep and calm. You are the one who does not belong, she swallowed hard. I mean no harm, his eyes narrowed. No one comes here without reason. I wanted to understand, she said softly. The stories they tell of you. Something flickered in his expression, bitterness, perhaps sorrow. Stories, he repeated. They make monsters out of men. They forget who started the fire. He looked past her, toward the horizon where the soldiers' old fort still stood in ruin. You are from their world. Their kind. I'm not, she whispered, her voice shaking. I don't belong to them. He studied her, silent for a long time. The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of rain and pine. Then he said quietly, Everyone belongs to someone, Duchess. Even those who think they are free. Her eyes widened. You know who I am? He turned his head slightly, the corner of his mouth tightening. I know what they call you. The woman who came across the ocean to forget. But the desert does not let people forget. It burns away what is false and leaves only truth. Her voice trembled. And what truth do you see in me? He stepped closer until she could see the scars across his shoulders, the faint trace of ash still clinging to his skin. Fear, he said. And something else. Something you don't want to name. Before she could answer, he turned and walked toward the ridge. The sun dipped behind the cliffs, painting his silhouette in firelight. She wanted to call out to stop him, but no words came. Only the whisper of his vow echoed in her mind again. Tonight you'll scream my name. The sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. The sheriff and 2 riders appeared on the trail, rifles slung across their saddles. You there! The sheriff called out, frowning as he spotted her. What are you doing out here? She hesitated, glancing toward where the Apache had gone, but he was already gone, vanished into the rocks like smoke. I was walking, she said softly. The sheriff dismounted, scanning the ground. His boots stopped beside the large footprints near the creek. He cursed under his breath. He was here. Damn fool's got the nerve to walk right through townland. He turned to her sharply. If you see him again, you run. You hear me? He ain't one for talking. Not anymore. She nodded faintly, though inside she knew that wasn't true. He did talk, just not with lies or fear. His words carried something heavier, something she couldn't yet understand. That night back at the inn, she couldn't sleep. The storm had passed, but the wind still sighed through the shutters. Every creak of the floorboards made her heart race. She sat by the window again, staring toward the ridge, half hoping to see him, half praying she wouldn't. Down in the street, a lantern flickered. She could just make out 3 men leading their horses toward the canyon, one of them the sheriff. They carried rifles and rope. She knew where they were going. The moon rose high over the mesa, cold and pale, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the town, a voice murmured in the wind, soft, steady, and full of promise. The Duchess shivered. Her hand pressed to the glass as if she could feel his presence across the miles of open land. The night stretched long and silent, and she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. What she felt now was something else entirely, an ache that both frightened and fascinated her. And as the last lamp in Pine Hollow flickered out, she whispered to herself in the dark, "He's coming." The next day began with a strange silence in Pine Hollow. The sun rose pale over the mesas, and the air carried a stillness that made even the horses uneasy. Word spread fast. 3 men had ridden out before dawn to hunt the Apache, but by mid-morning only 2 returned. Their faces were gray, their hands shaking as they dismounted before the sheriff's office. No one needed to ask what had happened. The look in their eyes told enough. One of them muttered, "He was waiting for us up there. We never saw him move, not once, till it was too late." The sheriff's jaw clenched. He said nothing, just turned and went inside, slamming the door behind him. The Duchess stood at the edge of the street, her cloak drawn close. She watched the dust settle around the rider's boots, her heart sinking. She didn't need to hear the rest. She knew who hadn't come back, and she knew the giant Apache had drawn first blood. By noon, the whole town buzzed with fear. Men gathered at the saloon whispering in low voices. Women barred their doors, and even the children were kept inside. It felt as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The Duchess could feel it too, the pull of something inevitable, something closing in from all sides. That afternoon, she found herself walking toward the outskirts again, unable to stay inside the safety of the inn. She followed the sound of the wind moving through the pines, her boots crunching over dry leaves. Every step took her further from town, further into the land that belonged to him. At the base of the ridge, she stopped. The air was warm, still, almost sacred. She knelt by the creek, touching the water, and for the first time she spoke aloud to the emptiness. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why do you look at me that way?" A voice answered behind her, calm and low. "Because you remind me of what I lost." She turned, and there he was again, standing beneath the shadow of a lone cottonwood. His eyes held the same steady fire. He stepped closer, and she could see the streak of dried blood on his arm, the dust clinging to his skin. "They came for me," he said. "I gave them a choice. They drew their guns first." She swallowed hard. "The sheriff won't stop now. He'll bring more men." He nodded. "Then more will fall. There'll be no peace left," she said softly, his gaze fixed on her, unreadable. "There was no peace the day they burned my people. You speak of peace because you've never had to fight for it." His words stung, but she didn't look away. "Maybe I'm fighting now," she said quietly. He studied her face, something softening in his expression. "You're different," he said. "You don't carry the scent of lies." The wind shifted between them, carrying the faint sound of distant church bells from the town. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the 2 of them, the noblewoman who didn't belong and the warrior who couldn't forgive. "Tell me," she said, "why did you come back?" He looked toward the horizon. "To finish what was started. To make them remember what they did." His tone was calm, almost sorrowful. "And because there is one name left on my list." Her heart skipped. "Who?" His eyes met hers. "You wouldn't understand. Try me," she whispered. He hesitated, then turned away. "A man who once wore a uniform of blue," he said finally. "He ordered the burning. He took my wife when she tried to flee. I saw his face. I never forgot it." She felt a chill crawl up her spine. "And he's here? In Pine Hollow?" He nodded once. "The sheriff!" The words hit her like a blow. She stepped back, her breath catching. "No, that can't be true." "He changed his name," the Apache said. "But men like him can't hide what's in their eyes. I saw him that night on the ridge. I know it's him." The Duchess tried to steady herself. The sheriff had been nothing but kind to her since she arrived, offering safety, food, a sense of order in this wild land. But now she wondered what kind of man wore kindness like a mask. The Apache stepped closer, his voice softer now. "You came here to forget, didn't you? To bury something?" She hesitated. "Yes, what was it?" "A man," she said after a long pause. "Someone I was to marry." He died before the wedding. My father said grief was unbecoming for a woman of my station, so they sent me away. They called it rest. I called it exile. He listened quietly, his eyes unreadable. Then you know what it means to lose everything, he said. She nodded. Yes, but I didn't burn the world for it. He looked toward the canyon again, his voice distant. You didn't have to. She wanted to tell him to stop, to leave before the sheriff came. But she knew he wouldn't. His life had already been shaped by fire, and men like him didn't turn from their path once chosen. When she returned to town, the tension was worse. The sheriff had gathered men in front of the jail, their rifles gleaming in the sunlight. She caught fragments of their talk. We ride at dusk. No mercy this time. He's hiding near the canyon. The sheriff's voice cut through them all. He's killed one of ours. We bring him back dead. The Duchess stepped forward. Sheriff, she said, her tone sharp enough to turn heads. You can't do this. He looked at her, his eyes cold. You don't understand this country, ma'am. There's no law for men like him. She met his stare. And what if there was once no law for you? The sheriff stiffened, his hand tightening on his gun belt. You'd best watch what you say. But she didn't back down. He said he remembers a man who burned his camp. A man who wore blue. The crowd went still. The sheriff's jaw worked, but no words came. Then he said quietly, You've been listening to stories told by killers. Don't let them twist your mind. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that vengeance and justice weren't the same thing. But when she looked at him now, she saw the flicker of something dark in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps fear. That night, the men rode out, their torches snaking into the desert. The town held its breath again. The Duchess waited by her window, unable to rest. Hours passed. The wind rose, and in the distance she heard gunfire echo through the canyon. Then silence. She grabbed her cloak and stepped out into the cold. The night sky stretched vast and black above her, the moonlight glinting off the wet stones. She followed the faint trail toward the ridge, her heart racing. Halfway there, she found a horse running loose, its saddle torn, its flanks streaked with blood. She pressed onward, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. When she reached the canyon, the ground was littered with spent cartridges and trampled dust. One torch still burned near the rocks. The sheriff's hat lay in the dirt, half buried in sand. Then she saw him, standing on the ridge, his figure outlined against the stars. The Apache. He was alive, untouched, his chest rising and falling slowly. For a long time, neither spoke. Then he said, It's done. Her voice broke.
You killed him?
He turned toward her, eyes dark in the moonlight. Justice took him. The earth claimed what it was owed. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't have to keep doing this. You could stop now. Leave this place. He shook his head. You don't stop a storm halfway through. She stepped closer, trembling. Then what happens to the rest of us, to me? He looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, You'll have to decide which side of the fire you stand on. The wind swept between them, carrying the scent of ash and sage. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The Duchess felt her heart twist. She knew what would come next. The army would ride again. The town would blame him for every drop of blood spilled. And in the middle of it all, she stood between vengeance and reason, drawn to both and belonging to neither. When she finally turned back toward Pine Hollow, the sky was growing light, and behind her, the giant Apache vanished into the canyon's shadow, as if the land itself had swallowed him whole. But she could still feel his presence, like a heartbeat in the ground beneath her feet, a promise that the story between them was far from over. The days that followed turned Pine Hollow into a town living on the edge of a whisper. The people spoke in low tones, doors stayed bolted after sundown, and no one went near the canyon anymore. The sheriff was gone, and though no one said it outright, everyone knew who had sent him to his grave. They buried what was left of him on the hill by the church, under a sky the color of smoke. The preacher said words about forgiveness, but they didn't settle right in anyone's heart. Forgiveness was a thing folks talked about when they were too scared to say vengeance out loud. The Duchess watched the burial from a distance, her hands clasped tight around her cloak. The townsfolk avoided looking at her, as if her presence was somehow tied to the curse that had fallen over them. They whispered that the Apache had come for her, that she was his sign, his lure, maybe even his accomplice. The more she heard, the more alone she felt. Still, she stayed. Something in her refused to leave. Something that told her the story wasn't over. Not yet. That night, the wind came hard from the desert. carrying dust and a low, distant rumble of thunder. The sky burned red on the horizon and the air felt thick, alive. She stood at her window again, staring out at the ridge. There was no movement, no light, but she could feel him out there. Watching. Waiting. A knock sounded at her door, soft and uncertain. When she opened it, she found the old barkeep standing there, hat in hand. His face looked worn, his eyes heavy with worry. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you best come downstairs. There's talk you ought to hear." In the lamplight of the inn, a group of men had gathered. Their voices were sharp, restless. "We can't live like this," one said. "He's still out there." "And she knows where he is." The Duchess froze in the doorway. The barkeep raised a hand. "That's enough. She's got nothing to do with this." Another man spat on the floor. "You believe that? He's been seen near the creek again, right after she takes her little walks. He ain't after us. He's after her. And if we give her up, maybe this town can sleep again." A low murmur spread around the room. The Duchess's chest tightened. She could feel every eye turn toward her. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "You think fear will save you? You think turning on someone will stop him? He doesn't hunt for sport. He hunts for truth." "Truth?" one of them barked out. "He's a murderer." The barkeep's hand slammed on the counter. So was the sheriff. The words silenced them for a heartbeat. Then the man nearest the Duchess muttered, "Maybe both of them deserve the same end." That night she didn't sleep. The tension in the air was so heavy it pressed against her chest. She packed her small satchel, unsure if she was running or returning. When dawn came, she slipped out of town and followed the old trail toward the canyon. The path was quiet except for the wind stirring through the sagebrush. When she reached the ridge, she found him sitting by a small fire, sharpening his knife with a piece of flint. He didn't look up when she approached. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "I had to," she answered. "They're turning against me. They'll come after you next." He stopped, finally meeting her eyes. "They always do." "Then let me help you." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Help me? You carry their tongue, their fear. You can't help what you don't understand." She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Maybe I understand more than you think. I know what it means to be blamed for something you didn't start. To be hated for who you are, not what you've done." He studied her for a long moment, then set the knife down. "You should go back. The desert doesn't forgive those who wander too far. Neither does grief," she said softly. "You think I don't see it? You carry your past like a chain. Every night you feed the fire so it doesn't die. But what happens when there's nothing left to burn?" His eyes darkened. "You talk like a woman who has never had to bury her heart in the dirt." "I buried it long ago," she whispered. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind and the crackle of the fire. Then he stood and turned toward the distant lights of Pine Hollow. "They're coming," he said. "I can smell the smoke on the wind. The men from Fort Mason, the army." Her breath caught. "How do you know?" "I've seen the dust on the horizon for 2 days. They'll reach the valley by sundown." She looked toward the town, fear gripping her. "They'll burn everything." He nodded slowly. "That's what they do." "But they're coming for you," she said. His jaw tightened. "Then they'll find me waiting." She shook her head. "You can't fight them all." He looked back at her, his voice low and steady. "A man who has nothing left to lose can fight longer than you think." She reached for him, her hand trembling. "Please, there has to be another way." He stepped back. "Go, Duchess. Go before the storm breaks," but she didn't move. "If they come, I'll stand with you." His expression softened, just barely. "You'd die for a cause that isn't yours?" "Maybe it is now." He stared at her for a long time before turning away. "Then we both have ghosts to answer to." As the sun fell behind the mountains, the first echo of gunfire rolled through the valley. The Duchess flinched, her heart racing. From the ridge, she could see the line of soldiers moving through the desert dust, torches flickering in their hands. The town bell began to ring, frantic and hollow. The Apache crouched near the rocks, loading his rifle with calm precision. "They'll start with the town," he said quietly. "They always do." She gripped his arm. "We can warn them." He shook his head. "They won't listen to you. Not now. To them, you're already one of mine." A burst of light flashed across the valley as the soldiers fired warning shots into the air. The sound rattled the cliffs. Smoke began to rise from the outer cabins. The Duchess's throat tightened. "They're burning it." His voice was steady, low. "Now they'll know how it feels." She turned to him sharply. "No, that's not justice." He didn't answer. He lifted his rifle, eyes narrowing as he watched the advancing line. The fire reflected in his gaze, and for a moment she saw the boy he must have been once, the one who'd lost everything in the same kind of fire. "Tell me something," she said suddenly. "When this ends, what then? What becomes of you?" He lowered the rifle slightly, his eyes still on the flames. "A shadow," he said. "That's all I've ever been since that night." The wind picked up, throwing sand into their faces. The fire at the edge of town spread fast, licking up the barns, the fences, the stables. The cries of horses carried through the air. She could hear people shouting, running. The army's shouts grew closer. The Duchess felt her heart twist. "You don't have to do this. You can walk away." He looked at her, the faintest trace of sorrow crossing his face. "And go where? There's nowhere left for men like me. The world took everything. This is all I have left." She stepped closer, her voice breaking. "Then let me give you something back. Hope. A reason to stop fighting." His hand brushed against hers, rough and warm. "Hope doesn't survive out here," he said quietly. "Only fire does." The air trembled with another round of gunfire. A bullet struck the rock near their feet, shattering stone. She gasped as he pulled her down beside him. "They've seen us," he muttered. She could see the soldiers now, dozens of them spreading out through the smoke, rifles raised. The night was alive with shouting and chaos. He looked at her one last time. "Stay behind me," he said. "If they take me, they'll kill you too." She shook her head, eyes wet. "Then I'll take my chances with you." He gave a small nod, the faintest hint of something like peace in his eyes. Then he rose from behind the rocks, the rifle firm in his hands, his shadow towering against the flames. The Duchess's breath caught as he stepped into the open, walking straight toward the line of soldiers and the storm that waited for him. The sound of gunfire cracked through the night, echoing across the valley. The Duchess cried out, but the wind swallowed her voice. The firelight flickered over the canyon walls, painting the world in red and gold. She could see him through the smoke, moving, relentless, unbroken. The giant Apache, the man who had vowed that no one would forget his name. And as the flames rose higher, the Duchess realized the truth. There would be no turning back, not for either of them. The night was no longer about vengeance or justice. It was about survival, and whatever fragile bond had grown between a wounded man and a woman who had lost her world long before she met him. The storm broke over Pine Hollow then, fierce and full of fire as the world held its breath for what would come next. Smoke hung thick over the valley, turning the sky into a dull shade of copper. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder, sweat, and burning wood. Pine Hollow was no longer the quiet frontier town it had been a week ago. The cries of frightened horses and the crackle of collapsing buildings filled the air as the soldiers swept through the street, their torches turning night into a storm of light and shadow. The Duchess stumbled through the smoke, her lungs aching, her heart pounding in her chest. Every gunshot sent a jolt through her body. Every scream reminded her that she might not live to see morning. She called his name but got no answer. Somewhere in the chaos, the giant Apache was still fighting. She saw him once through the haze, his broad figure silhouetted against the flames, moving with fierce precision. He fought not like a man bent on killing, but like one trying to protect what little humanity he had left. The soldiers outnumbered him, but they hesitated every time he charged through the smoke, as if something in his presence reached back into their own fear. The Duchess ran toward the well, where a group of townsfolk had gathered, trying to form a bucket line. The barkeep saw her and pulled her to shelter behind a wagon. "You shouldn't be here," he shouted over the roar. "They're rounding up anyone who looks like they've helped him." "I can't leave him," she said, breathless. He stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "He's as good as dead, ma'am." "You can't fight the army." Her voice broke. "Maybe not, but I can't let them erase him." Before he could stop her, she darted from cover and ran toward the edge of town. The wind whipped her hair as sparks flew through the air like fireflies. She climbed the rise overlooking the canyon, where the last of the gunfire echoed. There she saw them, the Apache standing alone before a ring of soldiers, his rifle empty, his breath heavy. Yet he didn't kneel. Even cornered, he stood tall, his eyes locked on the officer leading them. The Duchess froze, realizing the man in command wasn't a stranger. It was Colonel Reeves, a name she remembered from the letters her late fiancé once carried, letters about clearing territories and dealing with hostiles. The man who ordered the massacre that started it all was now here. Standing before his creation, Reeves raised his pistol. "You could have lived in peace," he said coldly. "You could have stayed in the hills. But you came back for vengeance. The Apache's voice was calm. No, I came back for truth, Reeves sneered. You think killing one man brings it back? No, the Apache said. But it ends the lie you built. The Duchess stepped forward from the ridge, her voice carrying through the smoke. Stop! Both men turned. The soldier stiffened as she stumbled down the slope, her face streaked with ash and tears. Reeves's expression hardened. Get her out of here! No! She cried. I know who you are, Colonel Reeves. I know what you did. I saw your letters. You burned their camp. You killed children. You did it because no one in Washington would question a man in uniform. The soldiers hesitated, their eyes flicking toward their commander. Reeves's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough, she said, her voice shaking. And so do they. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Reeves turned back toward the Apache, his hand trembling on the pistol. This ends now. Before he could fire, a shot rang out, not from the Apache but from one of his own men. Reeves staggered, eyes wide, then fell to his knees. The soldiers looked at each other, unsure. The man who'd fired lowered his rifle, his voice rough. My brother was in that camp, he said quietly. You called it victory. Reeves collapsed into the dirt, the firelight flickering across his lifeless face. For the first time in years, Pine Hollow went still. The battle was over. The silence that followed felt heavier than the fight itself. The Apache looked toward the Duchess. His body was trembling from exhaustion, blood running down his arm, but his eyes were steady. She moved to him, catching his weight as he began to fall. It's done, she whispered. He looked past her toward the burning town. Nothing's ever done, he said softly. The fire just moves. She held him tighter, feeling his breath grow faint. You can stop fighting now. You kept your promise, he shook his head slowly. No, my promise was never about revenge. It was about remembering. She brushed the dirt from his face, tears streaking her cheeks. Then remember this too, she whispered. You weren't alone at the end. He closed his eyes, his voice barely a murmur. The Duchess who forgot how to breathe. Now she teaches a dying man how. She let out a broken laugh, her hand trembling against his chest. You'll live, she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. He gave a faint smile. Maybe not here. But where my people rest, they'll know I tried. When the soldiers left the valley the next morning, the town smoldered in ruins. The barkeep and a few survivors began clearing what was left, gathering the wounded, burying the dead. The Duchess stayed by the creek at the edge of the canyon where the Apache had fallen. She had buried him beneath the cottonwood tree, the same one where she had first met him. She marked the grave with a smooth stone from the water, carving a single word into it with the blade he'd left behind. Truth. Days passed before the quiet returned. The air smelled of rain again, and the fields began to grow green along the riverbank. The people of Pine Hollow rebuilt what they could, though no one spoke openly about what had happened. The story became a whisper, then a myth, about the giant Apache who came down from the hills to face the men who wronged his people, and the foreign woman who stood beside him when no one else would. The Duchess stayed on in Pine Hollow, living in a small cabin near the creek. Some said she was waiting for someone who would never return. Others said she had found peace. Children sometimes saw her standing by the cottonwood at dusk, speaking softly as if to a friend unseen. And when the wind blew from the mesa, the townsfolk swore they could hear another voice answering, low, calm, and steady. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would stop to rest beneath that same tree. They'd see the weathered stone by the water and wonder about the story behind it. Some said the woman buried her lover there. Others said it was a grave for something larger, the last bit of justice left in a place too wild to keep it. The Duchess never corrected them. She knew that truth didn't need defending anymore. It lived in the land now, in the wind that carried the scent of sage and smoke and the call of distant coyotes. And every evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs and turned the world gold, she would whisper his name one last time. One spring morning, when the cottonwood bloomed white against the blue sky, she walked to the creek with a letter in her hand. It was the last she had written, though no one would read it. She placed it under the stone, pressing it into the earth. You were right, it said. The desert remembers. As she stood there, a soft wind rose from the canyon, stirring her hair, warm against her skin. For a moment, she could almost feel his presence beside her. The calm strength, the quiet eyes, the promise that had once been both a threat and a vow. Tonight, you'll scream my name, he had said, but in the end it wasn't a cry of fear that lingered. It was a whisper of love, carried on the wind long after the fires died and the world forgot their story. Pine Hollow rebuilt, as all places do, though its soul was never quite the same. The old tales faded into silence, but sometimes, on nights when the rain came soft across the plains, travelers would swear they heard drums in the distance echoing from the hills, faint, steady, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. The Duchess grew old by the creek, her eyes still bright, her voice still soft when she spoke of the past. And when she was gone, they buried her beside the cottonwood, under the same sky that had once burned with fire. Two graves now, side by side, marked by stones smoothed by time. And though the desert never speaks, it remembers. The land keeps its promises, even when people do not. Somewhere between the whisper of wind and the cry of the hawk, their story lived on. A tale of vengeance, redemption, and the strange, wild kind of love that only the old American frontier could bear witness to. And so, when the wind swept through Pine Hollow at night, it carried a sound that was not quite sorrow and not quite peace, just the eternal breath of two souls who had once stood against the fire, and in doing so, had become part of it forever.